Do we need to hit it on, or are we already recording?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. This is the Jobs and Business Development Committee of the Los Angeles City Council. Today is Wednesday, April 25th, 2012. It is Denim Day. If you don't know what that is, ask a friend. And that is why we're all wearing jeans, and more to come about that in City Council. But today we are continuing our discussion about the Business Tax Advisory Committee report and Blue Sky Consulting Group analysis relative to the phase out of the gross receipts tax. We just have one item today, so I think I might have just taken your job and saying what it was, but don't worry, you have job protection, so what do you want to say?
Item number 1 is a Business Tax Advisory Committee and Blue Sky Consulting Group to report relative to the phase out of the gross receipts tax.
Okay. We've asked Blue Sky to come forward and to answer some questions that we had. Let me frame some things. Please sit down. And thank you for being here again. Appreciate the work that you've been doing on this issue, Mr. Newman. And let me frame a few things just so when you're giving a presentation, we can have kind of these thoughts in mind. A lot of the work that we're doing in trying to design some sort of business tax cut or elimination here rides on a couple important academic assumptions and models. And so, you know, we had Btac through the CAO RFP, initially do this through Professor Swenson. We asked for a second opinion through the Office of Economic Analysis, and Blue Sky was retained for that. And the kind of debate back and forth about what effect really would a reduction or elimination of the gross receipts tax in Los Angeles do for business, depending on what assumptions we make, goes in all sorts of different directions. I think it's fair to say. So let me try to break down into a couple different categories what I'm trying to, as chair, get to the bottom of. One is what we've now talked about, the elasticity measure for tax reduction or increases. Specifically, when an increase or a decrease in taxes occurs, what does that do in terms of retarding or inspiring a business activity? And within that, there's two different sub-assumptions. One is, what model are we using in terms of like what sort of context? I think we can all agree in this room that the literature is both quite old and relatively sparse. I mean, there's a lot of studies that were done, but it actually, you know, as I've been doing this, I've been hoping there's some PhD student out there who's looking for his or her thesis topic and or dissertation topic and is saying, oh my God, this hasn't been updated since, you know, studies in the 90s before the economy has shifted in many important ways, and even those studies in the 90s drew on 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s data. You know, I don't know, it just surprises me because there's so much work that's done in this policy area, but that nobody has done that. That's neither your fault nor Professor Swenson's fault nor any of us in this room, but it certainly should be something that would make us all, I think, have all some greater comfort of knowing if it was more modern. That said, part of what was in the Btac study, which is the basis for much of the analysis that was presented to this committee, rides on whether we have an inter or an intra-city model. And so I want to unpack that a little bit later. In other words, is this competition between cities or kind of wider geography that is, presumably isn't coterminous, or is it within geography, intra-cities, when you have the division of many cities within a single, presumably metropolitan area? And then secondly, you know, what effect does do changes in our tax policies have? And it's not just one monolithic measure, as Blue Sky has here, as Btac has been looking at too. It may be in different categories, depending on the types of businesses, that there's different elasticity, because certain businesses are more portable than others, and you may have a greater economic effect or a lesser economic effect depending on which sort of categories we begin to chip away at the business tax on the way towards, hopefully, its elimination. So that's the first, elasticity. Secondly, for us, for Mr. Parks, I know for sure, for myself as equally strongly, the fiscal effect is the second category for us making a decision in terms of as policymakers. While something may be good for our local economy, we may have to weigh a loss in our own individual budget and government. It may come at the advantage of having more jobs, or if done right, as Btac has moved with the new proposal, and as Blue Sky has refined potentially even further, you may be able to have a reduction, as we did when we did the package 6 or 7 years ago, that tries to limit or even eliminate the negative fiscal impact on our city's budget, which is obviously incredibly important for us at this moment when we face the toughest 3 or 4 budgets, basically since the Great Depression in the city. So elasticity, then the fiscal effect. And within that fiscal effect, I would say there are 1 or 2 categories as well that we need to get a little bit more nuanced. It's not just the overall fiscal effect on all taxes. It is specifically the taxes we expect this city to have, because I think our CAO and our CLA and myself and all council members, that's what we're going to be focused on the most, is making sure we don't dig ourselves a further deficit in the midst of maybe what may be a good public policy initiative. Then I think the third in looking at this, which is now something that builds on our work from before, we haven't necessarily asked you to analyze, but I appreciate the work that you've put into it in terms of looking at the trigger mechanism now that Btac has put forward in terms of sort of a trapdoor, a fiscal trapdoor. In other words, if revenues aren't going up, to make sure that we don't dig a hole, what sort of mechanism could we have to stop any further reductions in business tax pending increases in revenue, so that we can stay at least even? Now, there's 2 different ways of looking at this. I appreciate what's in here. You could say, and it was always my worry, that just because we had a good fiscal year, it doesn't mean necessarily that's all from business tax reform. We all know the economy is a really important driver, and that is driven by a lot more than Los Angeles City's business tax level, and other things, entrepreneurialism, et cetera, that can have a remarkable effect on whether or not our revenues are going up or down. So there can be a way where we would account for things like inflation, look at our peer cities, see what revenue growth is everywhere. If there's additional revenue growth, we can then maybe say part of that could be accounted for by the reduction in taxes. It's a very good point, and it's a very difficult thing to measure. I mean, we could put in a measurement of it, don't get me wrong, but I guess it's not difficult to measure, but it's almost impossible, I think, after doing this for a decade, at finding true causality. We can kind of correlate something and say there is something that's making some additional business activity above and beyond what inflation is, above and beyond the rebound in an economy, and we can say that's because of the brilliant policies we put forward, and I think we're all here because we suspect that there is that effect, but we can never know for sure. So I wanted to frame those 3 things: the elasticity, that in terms of that measure, what model are we actually looking at, what effect do we have, is it when we do it partially, and are there certain sectors that we can have even a bigger bang for the buck. 2, what is the fiscal effect on our budget, and we have to try to take out not just the overall growth in our revenues, but maybe try to assign some of that to the policies around business tax. And 3rd, then what is the trigger mechanism to deal with that? I will say something, I will give my opinion first. If I don't want to take away the entire presentation, I will turn it over to you to give the presentation. I do want to say something on the page 13, 14, 15. I think one of the things, we're marking the 20th anniversary of the urban unrest in the city this week. And one of the most striking statistics of our local economy is that the county of Los Angeles has grown in those 20 years in terms of the jobs it has produced. Los Angeles City has declined. And not just declined per capita, it's declined in the number of jobs we have, while we've added about 700,000 people to the city. It's a pretty stark statistic. So in other words, the region has actually grown in jobs. The city, as an island inside that, has decreased, even though the population has grown. There are many reasons probably for that. I do believe our lack of competitiveness is a central one, though. When we look at a central city versus the Btac, which talks about a small suburban jurisdiction, unfortunately, Btac doesn't say anything that is the LA model. It is not a central city competing with other cities. We have one continuous metropolitan region. It's now the most densely populated in the country, according to the census, more than Newark metropolitan area. It's number 1. This is the Anaheim, Los Angeles, Long Beach metropolitan region, according to the census. It's 12 million people, more or less, of which 4 million reside in the city of Los Angeles. So we have 8 million other places inside the same city, essentially. We're not a small suburb, to take the words in the Btac study, based on one study that had much more elasticity. But we do play that same role, I believe, that a small suburban city would have with its neighboring cities, assuming these are basically coterminous parts of a single metropolitan area. Then what I read in the study, looking at inter-city dynamics, which is a smaller effect. So, we are not a central city competing with other central cities. We are one continuous city with these artificial boundaries between. And again, there is a lack of studies, but if you look at for instance, the slide on page 15, when I was looking at it, it's not misleading, but the only thing is you should have maybe, the 3.9 million bar and then an 8 million bar next to it. I mean, that's the rest of LA County, which is essentially what we're competing with. And within that, of course, there's nuances. There's a few places that may be as business unfriendly as us. Many are not. So when somebody goes to Vernon right next door, for all intents and purposes, not for all intents and purposes, they are in the same metropolitan region. They're in the same city, even if the political boundary is different. And they're going next door for some reason. Sometimes it's more industrial land. We don't have much of that left here. Sometimes it's the regulatory environment, but it may also be some of our tax structure. So with that, I will turn it over to you for the presentation before us. Thank you, Mr. Newman.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Those are indeed the issues that I had planned to address based on the letter that you sent last week. The first thing in that letter, though not necessarily in the order that you presented them, was, what do we think about the revised Btac proposal? And our assessment of the overall fiscal and economic impact of the revised proposal is that it's substantially similar to the original proposal. In both cases, the business tax would be eliminated. Originally, it was over a 5-year period. Now it's over a 15-year period. So both the tax relief effects and the economic effects would be more gradual. But at the end of the day, you'd have the same effect. An elimination of the business tax, an increase in economic growth would result, and that increase in economic growth would generate additional revenues, but not enough additional revenue to offset the loss of the business tax. I think there are two important distinctions between the revised proposal and the original one, as you alluded to. I actually alluded to one, the trigger mechanism. The second one is that the phase-in, I think, is deliberate on the part of Btac, they can tell you, but the first phase is targeted at mostly at Class 9, which is believed to be more mobile or more responsive to a tax cut than is the average Los Angeles sector. And I think that there's good reason to think about targeting, and I think there's a good reason to think that Class 9 may be more responsive than other classes. However, because Class 9 is so big, it's about 58% of all the tax revenue. It encompasses a lot of different kinds of companies, and on slide 6, I show the top 15 industries that are inside Class 9. And you can see a lot of them are professional services firms. A lot of them are healthcare related as well. And you might imagine that things like pharmacies and drugstores or doctors' offices would be somewhat less mobile or less responsive to a change in taxes than some other kinds of organizations, just because they want to be close to where their customers are, their patients are. In any case, it is a very big and diverse class. So as a result, what we found is that it is more responsive to changes in taxes than is the average, the economy in general, the average sector. We think targeting tax relief to classes 7 to 9, as the Btac proposes, would be about 10% more. You get about 10% more of an impact based on our analysis with the REMI model than if you just did across-the-board tax relief. However, even with that additional 10% benefit, the tax relief would trigger additional economic activity, but not enough to offset the loss in revenue. Now, if you did want to target tax relief a little bit more specifically, I think there are some principles that you might want to follow. That is, instead of targeting a whole class within the current business tax structure, you might want to focus on certain kinds of industries. For example, export industries. Those produce a bigger economic impact than does a locally serving kind of industry. So if you help a dry cleaner, that's not as good as helping a manufacturer or helping a service sector firm that sells services outside of the city. Secondly, you might want to concentrate on industries with a small concentration or a declining concentration in LA. If an industry is already highly concentrated here, that's an indication that those are businesses that are succeeding in this environment, whatever the characteristics are, even in spite of the taxes or whatever other obstacles there might be. Large and growing concentrations suggest that those businesses are doing well. However, if your concentration relative to the rest of the state or nation is declining, or you've got a small concentration, maybe those are sectors that could use a little extra help. So targeting a little bit more specifically might give you a little bit more bang for your buck. However, on slide 9 now, it's not likely that even that kind of more specific targeting would necessarily be able to pay for itself. You'd have to have a responsiveness to a tax cut that was maybe on the order of 20 times or more what the average is for a particular industry or sector to have a kind of a supply side or a Laffer curve response where a tax cut for that sector would pay for itself. And there may be sectors out there that are like that. We haven't specifically looked at every subsector of the economy, and that's a piece of analysis that could be done. But it doesn't seem likely based on what we found with the REMI model and our looking at the literature. And finally, I think it's worth mentioning that tax relief should probably be considered in the context of other economic development efforts. There may be existing efforts or planned efforts to help specific sectors or invest in training for certain kinds of workers or other things that the city or the region may be engaged in. And those things should be considered in conjunction with whatever tax relief efforts the city might engage in, so you get kind of a cooperative effort that's more than the sum of its parts. Plus, each of these things have a cost, and the cost effectiveness of each can be evaluated better when they're compared to each other. The second issue in the revised Btac proposal relates to the trigger mechanism. Now, as I understand the trigger that they've proposed, it would set a benchmark at the current levels, and then increases in revenue above that would count towards pulling the trigger for the subsequent phases of tax relief. Now, what that does do is it insulates the city's budget from a very large impact, or a kind of locked-in ongoing impact. Even if the city is in a recession, for example, additional business tax relief would not be offered in that kind of a context. But if what we're trying to do is measure to what extent the business tax relief has contributed to economic growth over and above what would have occurred anyway, the trigger mechanism probably doesn't do that. And that's because economic growth will occur because of all kinds of other things. Population growth, inflation will make revenues increase in the city. Demand for the city's industries products that are sold outside of the city will increase economic activity. And the income of city residents. Some of the city residents work outside the city, and those other 8 million workers or other 8 million residents, don't all work where they live. And so increases in income for city residents will also increase tax revenue for the city. So trying to control for some of those things would allow you to create a more targeted or refined trigger that I agree, it'd be very difficult to very precisely measure the impact of the business tax relief. In fact, that's what all the literature we've been discussing in our previous meetings, and that's what the sort of substance of our discussions has been, is what is the responsiveness of businesses to a tax cut. But you could do a little bit better than just setting a benchmark at today's levels. And there's lots of ways to do that, and we would be happy to discuss them in more detail, but you could set a projection and then say it increases above that projection count. You could try to adjust revenues for population growth or inflation. You suggested comparing to revenue growth for neighboring jurisdictions. You could look at revenues per dollar of personal income statewide. There's a number of things you could do, or a combination of these things, that would produce a more refined kind of a trigger. And then the last topic is really this elasticity topic. And in the meeting last week, which I wasn't able to attend but listened to, it was suggested that perhaps we had ignored a part of the research that was relevant to the circumstances here. And all we're doing here is simply relying on Bardic's own conclusions. He divides the research up into these two groups, the small suburbs, or the intra-suburban or intra-metropolitan competition, and the central city competing with its own suburbs studies. And there are specific studies that address that issue. Now, as you suggested, there are...
Sorry, so just say that again, because my understanding, and it wasn't that it was... there was inter-region, correct? Was one of the categories?
There's actually four groups of studies. The main result he reports is for interregional or interstate competition. So that's one region competing with another region located elsewhere. Okay. He also looks at intra-regional, which is really the suburbs competing with each other. And admittedly, in his book, he doesn't make as clear this distinction between suburbs competing with each other and central cities, but he published an academic paper the year after his book was published with the same content in it, and in that paper, he makes clear that there's this distinction. There's the suburbs competing with each other, and then there's the central city competing with its suburbs. And then the fourth class is central cities competing with other regions around the country.
So your elasticity measure comes from his research on the second?
No, our elasticity measure is actually the first, the region competing with a region. And the reason for that is that there's very little research on the other two categories that relate to central city, well, really on the other three. There's suburbs competing with each other, there's central city competing with its own suburbs, and there's central city competing with the rest of the country. Now, on the subject of the central city competing with the rest of the country, the research there is mixed. I believe there's 4 studies that he talks about, and there's some show an effect and some don't. And the same is true for central cities competing with their own suburbs. Some studies show an effect and some studies don't. And so Btac's own comments about that on slide 14 are that studies that have examined the effects of central city versus suburban tax rates on the central city's share of the metropolitan area's business activity have not consistently found tax effects. Now, as you suggest, perhaps LA is different from other regions. I think it probably is. Every region is unique to some extent, but this is nevertheless an effect that the research was trying to measure. Every central city to some extent competes with its suburbs. And that research didn't show an effect. And rather than say, well, we think there's a zero effect of tax changes, we looked at the inter-regional competition as being the one that was really the focus of Btac's work, had the most number of studies. There's 57 studies there, and that's really what he focused on. And rather than suggest there's no effect, which frankly I don't believe to be the case, we took that as an average measure because really what we think LA is doing is competing to a large extent with the rest of the state and the rest of the country. Right? In order to really succeed economically, it's not just going to be able to pull some businesses back from Vernon, as you say, but it's going to have to get businesses from Phoenix and Atlanta and all the rest of the country. Because it's so big, there's just not enough activity just in the surrounding regions. There's reason to believe that the overall region will do better if it does that. So that should be the focus of its efforts. The research doesn't support that it can really take enough business from the surrounding suburban jurisdictions to succeed. And so that's not a piece of research that we relied on, and I don't think it's an economic development strategy that the city should rely on. And lastly, I'd like to point out, well, as you suggested on slide 15, yes, LA is surrounded by lots of other people, but it certainly is, if there's a central city anywhere in this region, it's LA. I mean, it is 10 times bigger than the next biggest city. And it's the biggest city in the state. So it certainly looks a lot more like a central city than a small suburban jurisdiction. One last point on that, too. Before we rely on this intra-suburban competition, I think it's worth noting that not only are those particular studies fairly old, there's 14 studies in that group. 10 of them relate to manufacturing, and 12 of them relate to property taxes. So it's really the responsiveness of manufacturing companies to changes in property tax rates. Now, the academic research in general suggests that because manufacturing industries are very capital intensive, they are more responsive to tax changes than are other industries, and particularly with respect to taxes on capital, like a property tax. That's their manufacturing equipment, and they're competing nationally or internationally, and so any increase in their costs they can't pass on to their customers, and therefore they're very responsive to tax rates. So I think trying to rely on that elasticity number, one, is kind of a misapplication of what the focus of the studies was, and two, I think it's a kind of a study of a different circumstance than we have. We're not looking at manufacturing companies for the most part. We're looking really at a service sector economy. The last point I wanted to make is that we didn't just rely on what the published research showed. We relied on the REMI model as well. And what the REMI model shows is in effect very similar to what the kind of average of the interregional competition studies from Btac shows. In other words, a relatively small elasticity number, but still a big multiple if you were to cut business taxes by about 400 million, you'd probably get an increase in economic activity of nearly $1 billion. So there's definitely a response to that tax change, but it's just not on the order of 10 or 20 or 30 times what the initial impact of the tax number is itself. So the REMI model results are fairly consistent with what the published research shows. And in our opinion, given the lack of data, given the age of the research, and a number of other factors, is a very good way to look at this kind of a tax change, and is a way that other regions have also examined the impact of a gross receipts tax.
Thank you.
Sure.
So here's some of my conclusions listening to you. One is that we're pretty much we're flying pretty blind. I mean, we're asking you and asking Professor Swenson and asking Btac and asking ourselves to do this without much modern data specific to our model. Whenever we get kind of deep in there, my sense at least is just as somebody who really wants great numbers that apply right to us. I mean, as policymakers, this is the frustration we always have, of course, that nobody ever designed their studies around where our policies are moving, and nor should they have, because they didn't know where we were necessarily going to go. But that nobody has done that. I think we're flying pretty blind. But when we see through the clouds a little bit occasionally when we are flying, to me, some of the main predicates of all of this are quite flawed or don't necessarily apply to us. And I think what I heard from you is your central assumption does rest on an idea that we are a central city. I mean, when I looked at the elasticity measures, it was 5 to 30 times greater than your range if you took the one that was intra rather than inter. Is that?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say my range. I'm simply relying on Btac's own conclusion about the difference between a central city and a small suburban jurisdiction.
Right, but you took one of those. And in fairness, the report didn't present that it could be either one of these models. It said it's more likely to be this model, and in that it was, I think, what was it, 1.1 to 2? Was it the elasticity was, and you took, or 1.2 to 2 or something. Anyway, I did the calculations last week. I don't have them right with me, but we kind of all at the table crunched then, looking at that the piece where he's saying that you have a multiplier, the elasticity measure of 10 in one of the intra, is the quote you have here, 10%, it can see the reduction from 10 to 30%. Using your most conservative with his most conservative, your most impactful with his most impactful, it was an increase of somewhere between 5 and 30 to the range that you gave.
Yeah, that's right. If you are just looking at his intra-suburban elasticity numbers, they're about 10 times bigger than his inter-regional elasticity numbers.
Okay, and I think we can bring those numbers later. But it was as low as 5. It was as high as 30, depending. And obviously, this is based on that 30%. But this really does rely, and we don't need to debate this. I mean, we all live here in Los Angeles, and this is just something as a public policymaker. As you may know, and I'm not saying this in any campaign way, I'm running for mayor right now, so I'm going to use this as an example. I'm talking to a lot of people around the city. And so many people that I talk to who come to events for me or something saying, so I live in Santa Monica, I'm looking forward to voting for you. Or I'm in Culver City, and can I vote? I'm in West Hollywood, you've done great work in my neighborhood. None of those cities are in the city of LA. So for those of us who live here, people really don't look at, oh, I'm in Long Beach and I'm 10% the population of Los Angeles. That is a completely artificial political boundary. For the social and business kind of and economic landscape, this is one metropolitan region. So while none of Btac's models completely fit in here, it very much does not seem like an intercity. While there isn't to say there isn't some competition that goes on, and LegalZoom is a company that was in my district. It's moved to Glendale for most of its operations here, but it's also moved some of its operations, its expansions, to Austin. So there is for sure, that's going on. But the bulk, 2/3 of their employees still are. They just decided we're moving to Glendale, and one of the reasons they decided was because of our business tax here. I think the larger factor also was the price of rents in Glendale, which are the lowest we've ever seen, and it's almost impossible for a place like Hollywood, which has much higher rents, to compete with that. So this isn't the only factor. But in looking at that, I mean, to me, that we don't have something that models who we are, and the one that's closer seems to be one that has a higher multiplier. And I'm not trying to fit this in. I'd be the first person to say if I felt really good with Professor Swenson's data and methodology and your analysis too, that I would embrace one of them 100% regardless of whether it went where I want it to go as a public policymaker. I mean, I've wanted to cut and to kill our business tax, but I'm not going to do that at the expense of our budget. So I'm trying to be extremely honest with the data that's presented, the conclusions that are made, and then overlaying them on the reality I know of those businesses I talk to, the people who live here, and the competition that is ongoing here. And I think you're right. I mean, if we're honest, the dry cleaner ain't going to pick up and go to Arizona. They're going to stay in that neighborhood, serving that neighborhood. There are certain companies that need to be here. Apparel, we're not competing with a lot of other places in the United States. They're going to go broad, but apparel would probably stay here, but they will go to industry and to Vernon instead of the city of LA, based on very close to that manufacturing model that you're talking about. It's a set cost that they have, and when they're looking at, it's not just that we have a small business tax, as folks said. If you're only making a 10% margin, it's tenfold more of that margin. It suddenly goes from a 0.5 to a 5% additional cost. And it was cited to me by a number of companies that left. They said, for instance, companies that are going public, said it might not seem like a lot, but for a LegalZoom, having the city's business tax was what they estimated when they do their IPO was somewhere in the $5 to $10 million valuation range. That's huge for them. They might be $1 billion company when they go public or whatever it is, but that is very, very large. So using the intermetropolitan elasticity effect, I think there may be part of that. Let's say we take that 10 times measure that you're talking about, instead of 5 to 30, let's say it's 10 times more for the suburbs competing with each other. I mean, we're a city of suburbs is kind of the cliche people always say. I think we're actually a city of cities, but all stuck in a larger city. But there may be a piece of that is intermetropolitan, but I would say the bulk of it right now is intra. And I go back to that first statistic that I said, which is that the county has grown in jobs and the city has gone down. To me, that means there's something that we're doing wrong here. Not the only factor. Like I said, we're more crowded. We've lost industrial land, so people have had to go elsewhere to do. You can't find land here. I mean, it's just a very difficult thing to do. But a big portion of it must be intra. And I don't want to, I don't need to get into a back and forth. I appreciate the work that you've done here. And similarly, with all due respect, I read part of Professor Swenson's stuff, and I felt like there were some flaws there or some assumptions that didn't rest as easy with me. When Btac has presented its report, I will, as chair of this committee also, I'm not singling you out because you've said the things that I don't like to hear. I'm going to be pretty even with my criticism with everybody. But that still, as we move towards actually making a recommendation to the full council, that was the main question that I wanted answered today. And don't worry about defending the work. It doesn't have to be, I think you've done good work, and I really appreciate that. The Remy model, I almost want to dig in there and take the whole thing apart so I can understand it better. The Btac stuff is so frustratingly inapplicable, outdated, and for the intra stuff, as you said, it's very few studies. So if they're flawed, you have a huge variation rate on margin of error there. But I'm trying to fly this plane somewhere, and I don't want to land it in the wrong city. So with that, Mr. Parks, if you have some questions for Blue Sky, and then I know we have a number of public speaker cards, and we have some folks from Btac as well.
Yes, I don't have any questions. I'd just like to make a couple of comments. One of the things I think, having read the material, and particularly the April 18th report from the CAO that talks about the $135 million of tax breaks that we've given already and seeing what the end result, what I believe, and I've thought this since I've been on the council, that a lot of things we do impacts a larger region and maybe not Los Angeles. We can't dictate that if we give a tax break that all of this business activity is going to occur in Los Angeles, nor can we dictate that all the people who are going to be hired are going to live in Los Angeles and stay in Los Angeles. If you had that closed loop, you'd get probably more of the benefit. And so, unlike when Eric mentioned that if the county is growing, I don't look at it as that they're doing right and we're doing wrong. I think they're getting the benefit of a lot of things we're doing, but that we can't keep within our boundaries. And I don't know quite, when we look at that business activity, I don't know quite how you could corral it and just keep it in one localized area. The one thing I do sense is that in looking at $400 and some odd million, 400 and some odd $100 million, about 10% of our budget. I don't know if I would have voted for some of the tax breaks if I knew that we were going to get so low of return in the city of LA, particularly when we are doing so many things to attract people to the city, saying that you can get 3 years or 5 years or no business tax. If we saw that the return in some instances was significantly below what we perceived, and it's somewhat, when we analyze it, different than what was the verbal anecdotal information, that after we gave 15% cuts, everyone assumed that the growth in business tax was because of that. And what we found, in essence, is that a lot of it had to do with Office of Finance finding businesses that were non-reporting, and what is AB 63 or something. Then the other thing we found out is that even with those tax breaks, the non-tax revenue was minimal. So I look at the fact that because we're so large, and we are 10 times larger than anyone else, that we impact, in many instances, cities that are suburbs and even in the state, because we're doing things in such a large volume that you can't help but impact your surrounding areas. But I don't think you're able to analyze and dollar for dollar figure out where that benefit comes from. So
Just to respond to that point, the REMI model that we use was built just for the city of Los Angeles. It's a model of the city of Los Angeles' economy. We also looked at what the impact would be on the county as a whole. We had REMI working with them. We made a custom model for the city of LA, but they actually have a model already built of the county of Los Angeles, and we asked them to run some numbers for us with that model. And using the same amount of business tax reduction, which would produce about $1 billion of increased economic output for the city. This was several weeks ago now, so I don't recall exactly, but I think the impact on the county as a whole is about 2.5 times as big, so much bigger. And what that means is just what you're saying, that a lot of the economic activity that's generated leaks out of the city. I believe I mentioned this before, but a lot of people who work in the city live outside of the city, and they spend their money at home. And a lot of the businesses that are in the city that benefit from a tax cut have suppliers located outside of the city. And so that activity does leak out. So there is a much bigger effect on the region than just on the city itself. But we were obviously, because it's the city's economy and budget that's at issue here, that's what we focused on.
See, and I think we find that in a local sense in districts. I know Jan Perry did a study a while back that showed because of a lack of certain kinds of businesses, such as grocery stores, restaurants, electronic stores, they lose like $1 billion a year bleed out, because people are going to spend the money. They just have to find where to spend it. And so I think that's what I view it as. We're so large that we're impacting the region and larger. And again, sometimes we believe that if we do something locally, we're going to get the total benefit, and that doesn't appear to be something that we should be expecting.
Yeah, and that's when I listed a couple of the principles you might want to think about if you were targeting tax relief on slide 8. When you look at an industry with a low concentration, what you're doing for those industries is you're importing those goods or services or types of activities, whatever it is. So if you don't have enough grocery stores, you have a low concentration of grocery stores, you're importing grocery purchases from the surrounding region. And that's why targeting those kind of sectors that have a low concentration in LA might make sense, because then you don't have to import that kind of economic activity any longer.
Yeah, I mean, we have that with our big box stores. I mean, Culver City has a finger that goes into the city of Los Angeles, where they put a whole Home Depot and a whole bunch of big box stores. They get the fiscal impact or a greater percentage of it, because much of it goes through the state. But the way we have our land use policy in California, fiscalization of land use policy allows them to reap the benefits, and essentially all the shoppers are Los Angeles City residents. So that does exist. To your point, Mr. Parks, I think no one in any of the studies, not the Swenson, Btac, Blue Sky, CAO analysis, has said there hasn't been an increase in economic activity as a result of business tax changes. I think you're right, though, and this is what we're trying to get to the bottom of. What is the revenue piece? And within that, what is going to be the impact on the budget, which is, I think, part of the design now that Btac has brought to us, to have some triggers to make sure there's no net negative. We have a stack of cards here in 15 minutes. So unfortunately, we're and maybe we can, if you want to hang around, we can talk a little bit in council just informally too. But we've got Jessica Duboff, if you'd like to come forward from the Chamber of Commerce. I'm going to ask just 3 people at a time. Why don't we pull one of the chair around? Ann Williams and Martha Cox Natikman to come forward. Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Jessica Duboff. I'm here on behalf of the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce and our 1,600 member organizations. We would like to thank Btac for all their efforts and hard work over the last 2 years to find a way to help Los Angeles attract new business and support our current ones. The Chamber strongly supports the recommendation before the committee today for a step-by-step reduction and phase-out of the gross receipts tax over 15 years. While we support the complete elimination of the business gross receipts tax, we recognize that a phased-in approach will be required in order to balance the benefits of encouraging economic growth with the possible short-term reductions in revenue to operate the city. We appreciate the thoughtful simplification strategy Btac has designed to reduce the tax while setting clear benchmarks to measure progress and success. We look forward to working with Btac, the mayor, and council on implementation to spur job creation and show Los Angeles is open to compete for business. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Appreciate it.
Good morning. I'm Ann Williams with the Central City Association. CCA represents 450 businesses which collectively employ over 350,000 individuals throughout the city of Los Angeles. I'm here to offer CCA's support to Btac and its proposed 15-year phased elimination of the gross receipts tax. The city's current gross receipts tax rates, with their convoluted tax structure and classification system, put our city at a crippling disadvantage in attracting, retaining, and growing new businesses. The compromise before the committee today reflects a sensible approach to improving the business climate while balancing the need for fiscal responsibility. The built-in triggers will ensure that the city remains fiscally solvent, and the phased reduction in the gross receipts tax rate and classification system will make LA competitive with its neighboring jurisdictions. Our current tax structure that gouges the region's primary source of employment, that is, its service-based businesses, is counterproductive, especially when you consider that nearly 53% of jobs in Los Angeles fall within this classification. As Chairman Greif stated in the last Btac committee meeting, taxes should at worst be neutral and at best be the source of encouragement for business location and job creation. CCA agrees, and we believe a phased elimination of the gross receipts tax would do away with what has become the most iconic example of LA's overly aggressive tax policies. Thank you.
Good morning, Councilmember. Martha Cox-Nittigman. I'm with the Building Owners and Managers Association. We represent over 155 million square feet of office space, about 300 commercial building owners. About half of that is in the city of LA. We also want to support the Btac proposal. I want to kind of give anecdotal testimony, which really has to do with losing tenants consistently across borders. I just got a call yesterday from someone from Cushman & Wakefield who indicated they consistently lose. These are service sector tenants basically across the street into Culver City, and I know other building owners and managers have said the same thing. So I know it's just a piece. You need to look at the whole economy. You mentioned manufacturing earlier, but it is true. It continues to happen, and so we do support the 15-year phase-out that Btac has proposed.
Thank you very much. Stuart Waldman, Tracy Rafter, and Charles Swenson.
Thank you, council members. I'm Stuart Waldman. I'm president of the Valley Industry and Commerce Association, VICA. We have 370 business members who've created over 100,000 jobs in the city. VICA is a founding member of the Axe the Tax Coalition, which you can find more information at axthetaxlosangeles.com, along with the Central City Association and Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce. We'd like to thank the Business Tax Advisory Council for their tireless work in moving our city toward a tax structure that promotes job creation and economic growth. Despite institutional pressures and 2 faulty reports commissioned by city bureaucrats, Btac has persevered by crafting a plan that consolidates the rate categories and gradually reduces the gross receipts tax. While ideally we would like the 5-year phase-out, we will accept the 15-year phase-out because any phase-out is better than no phase-out. As Councilmember Parks mentioned, Los Angeles does impact the region. In fact, the city of Los Angeles helps the cities of Glendale and Santa Clarita and Calabasas attract business because of this rate. The fact of the matter is that the business community cannot and will not continue to sustain this tax. With every step away from complete and timely elimination, you push our members to leave LA behind. The time for change is now. The gross receipt tax is a mechanism for a different time and a different Los Angeles. We ask that you stand up for today's Angelenos. Thank you.
Thank you. Impressive website. I just saw it. Please, Tracy.
Hi.
Good morning.
Hi, I'm Tracy Rafter. I'm wearing two hats today. I'm the CEO of the LA County Business Federation, for which we've organized 100 of the top business associations throughout the county. We do represent all 88 cities, and we do view the county and its productivity in that lens. I also am going to speak on behalf of being an LA City business owner. So I'm paying the highest, personally, for my own company, Empower Inc., paying the highest tax rate, and also live it every day and making decisions with my own company where I'll be positioned. So I'm wearing both hats. And council members, I would just suggest that slide 3 that was presented by Btac today, if this is your vision of LA City, which is to continue to grow population and by 30% and decline jobs by almost 10%, while the other 87 cities grow their population at the same 1/3 and increase their jobs at 17%, then proceed and don't take action and don't implement eliminating the business tax. The other 87 cities are quite happy with this. We represent them too. If your vision for LA City is different than this, then you have to take action. You have to eliminate the business tax. I think that the report by Btac to take it as an approach, very sophisticated, very smart, dealing with the most mobile tax class, which is a professional tax, easy to move. We're not manufacturing. We can go anywhere, anytime, is very smart. Doing it over 15 years, as Stuart said, versus 5 is not ideal, but I understand that we live in a real world and you have to be responsible about that. And BizFed would support elimination getting there. I also just want to caution that after 5 years on this plan, we're still the worst. LA City will still be the worst after 5 years, so it's not a panacea, but it's progress and we support it.
Thank you, Tracy. Appreciate it. Mr. Swenson.
Good morning. Charles Swenson, University of Southern California, largest employer in the city of Los Angeles. A couple of comments.
You guys looking at going elsewhere?
No, we can't. But we don't pay business
That's
taxes.
So. Hey, you don't pay the business tax. It's the best category of all.
It is. A couple of comments. First of all, I laud Btac for taking, I think, a fiscally responsible approach in terms of setting up triggers for this. Secondly, I stand behind my work. As you noted, Mr. Chair, in some ways we're kind of flying blind on some of these because the prior research has not been directly on point. They've looked at property taxes. Some of them are old, that sort of thing. In fact, that was the reason why I did an empirical test to look at what had happened in prior Los Angeles city business tax cuts to try to get some calibration for this exact setting, and those tests drove my estimates of elasticity. But you know, to be fair, you do get some wide variations. So based on my estimates, gradually over time, I project that this the tax cut, the elimination of the tax would create about 100,000 jobs, and eventually pay for itself. Blue Sky's estimates are that there would only be 27 million of indirect revenue and only 7,000 jobs created after multiplier effect, which seems awfully low given we have 4 million people in the city. So you get some huge variations in that. Again, I stand behind my work, and I think the fiscally responsible thing to do is to do what Btac has recommended, and that is to have, if we go forward with this, is to have these triggers or trapdoors that you mentioned.
Thank you. Do members of Btac want to? We have 6 minutes, so I'm going to be tight with time because we have transportation time to get down to the chambers as well, which is at least a minute and a half. So we'd like to take a few minutes.
Sure. First, I'm going to hand out a statement from the LADC that I received this morning. So just enter that into the record. I'm not going to read it since we're short on time, but you have a copy of it. It effectively says that the LADC supports Btac's recommendation and supports reformation and ultimate elimination of the gross receipts business tax. I have 3 colleagues who I guess they're going to leave me up here. Come on, get up here. I know we got limited time, but there's actually 4 members of Btac here, which is half our committee. I'm pleased to report it was unanimous. Our recommendation was unanimous. We've looked at with the same amount of time you've had apparently to look at Blue Sky's response, and I find multiple issues with it. Not the least of which is that they do admit that the multiplier that they use from a elasticity standpoint was one that dealt with interregional, going from like Denver to Los Angeles or going from New York to Los Angeles. And point of fact, that's not what we're facing here. What we're facing here, as I think some of the other members of the public have now stated, is you're facing having the same thing that I think the Milken Institute observed in a study that they did some years ago, that there's been white-collar job flight from the city of LA, and there's been blue-collar job flight from the city of LA, with white-collar going to West Side, places like Beverly Hills and Santa Monica and Culver City and what have you, and blue-collar going to places like El Segundo, by the way, and blue-collar going to places like Vernon and City of Industry and what have you, just effectively going to more appropriately taxed jurisdictions. You talk about this business tax, and you forget that when you look at the cost of labor, healthcare insurance, you look at transportation costs, you look at other costs in LA County, they're very comparable. So what's the one thing that stands out that is different? And the one thing that stands out that is different and it is measurable is the business tax. And therefore, that is causing these businesses to make a decision to either not locate in the city of LA to begin with, leave the city of LA, or expand outside of the city of LA. All of those are negative, extremely negative for jobs in this city. And you're looking at a situation where there has been, over the last 30 years, job growth in the other 87 cities, but not job growth in the city of LA. So when Blue Sky says, hey, look at the trigger mechanisms and factor in things like forecasts and inflation and population growth, my response is, if you do that, then why don't you go ahead and factor in, instead of it being revenue neutral, it doesn't need to be revenue neutral, because the business tax receipts, if you continue to operate the way you are right now, is not a status quo. It will go down. Over time, if this city continues to have the onerous tax rates it has right now, you will see a shrinking ball. And so if you want to do your triggers that way, then go ahead, but adjust it, and now you're not trying to make up for $425 million, you're trying to make up for a lower amount over time. And what we had proposed was just looking at it and trying to take all of the gamesmanship out of it by having people start talking about, hey, let's make believe what the numbers should be at some future point, and just say, freeze it at this point in time, and say, this is what the indirect revenues are, and this is what the direct revenues are, and if there's an increase, and then when you start backing out the taxes, and we propose a very moderate reduction in taxes over 15 years, and then look at what that, are you maintaining at least that level, and do a 3-year check and a 5-year check and an 8-year check, et cetera.
Got 2 minutes.
Okay.
Run the clock on you just so you can see it.
The other thing is, I want to register the fact that the Milken Institute has weighed in on this. The Milken Institute will be presenting something in writing. They've got their global conference next week. But we did consult with the Milken Institute. We provided them with a copy of Dr. Swenson's report. We provided them a copy of Blue Sky's report. I think the Milken Institute is beyond reproach. What they have done in this case has been totally out of interest and pro bono, out of interest to the city. They've not been paid, unlike these other two consultants. They have come back and indicated to me that they believe that the work that Professor Swenson did was directionally correct and was structurally sound. They had no issues with the technical work that he had performed, and they feel that he is definitely. They felt his conclusions were within the realm of possibility. They did not say the same thing about Blue Sky Consulting, and they had some concerns about the work that was done by Blue Sky Consulting. But since I've only got 1 minute now, I can't really get into the details. I will say that from an elasticity standpoint, it's not just the elasticity that Btac cites, which is an elasticity that is much more significant. The elasticity he cites is, as you have observed, anywhere from 5 to 30 times, or I think his elasticity is 1.0 to 3.0 for this situation, for a situation where you have a city like Los Angeles, where, let's face it, LA is not just one little blob surrounded by all these other cities. LA is kind of interwoven and intermixed amongst all these other jurisdictions. So when you look at LA, you're looking at San Fernando Valley, you're looking at other parts of LA, you're looking at West Los Angeles, you're looking at downtown. You're not just looking at downtown. And the point is that from a multiplier standpoint, there's even beyond Btac saying 1.0 to 3.0, which Blue Sky ignored and still is ignoring, and still instead citing an elasticity multiplier effect of 0.2. There's another authority out there by the name of Heilbrunn, who published a work called Urban Economics and Public Policy, and he said when you look at a major metropolitan city like Los Angeles, the multiplier is a specific one, and it's more like 0.95 to 1.45. Versus this 0.2 apparently is looking at all metropolitans, whether they're large or small. LA is not, you can't mix LA in with all these other cities and say, let's use the average elasticity and it's going to be valid.
Okay. Thank you and well done. Office of Finance, we have not forgotten about you. And thank you for listening in. We also asked Office of Finance to produce some things that both Mr. Parks and I think I'd like to do is take the next step next week of looking and we'll work with you in the coming days. I know the mayor actually cited, right after we spoke at the State of the City, he had some stats that had been provided by the Office of Finance right along the lines of what we were trying to figure out. So I think you may have done some of that research coincidentally right at the right time. But to see, to Mr. Parks and my questions, how much was AEB 63 discovery? How much? I mean, that's the big question I've always had, Professor Swenson, about the study that you've put forward is certainly there was a correlation, and I think there's sound research design around the correlation, but the causation of whether or not, once we take out the number of businesses that we know that came from discovery, we can actually get the net number that may have come from the impact of business tax reductions, to answer both Mr. Parks's question and mine. So we'll work with you. Look forward to having Office of Finance present some numbers for us next week. I'd like to continue this in committee in the meantime. I know you've flown down, so like I said, we can chat a little bit in council. I'll walk down with you. And thank you to the groups of folk that have come here to begin to engage in this. I think we are on the brink of really getting to the core of some pretty well thought out assumptions, and hopefully from that some good recommendations of what we can take to council. I would like certainly, as we look at the budget for this year and as we start the new fiscal year, to have in place the direction of where this city would like to go. And I continue to believe that reduction, if not eventual elimination, this just comes from conversations I have every single day, is going to have a net positive economic impact, and nobody has disputed that. We now have to get the level of what the fiscal impact will be for the city and see if we can't design that in a way that protects the city budget as well. So with that, thank you everybody for packing a lot into an hour, and we will see you next week.
Are you continuing?
Without objection.
Yeah.